Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event with Laird Hunt, discussing his latest novel, Zorrie, in conversation with Erica Wagner. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved community that we are able to make events like this happen. So thank you so much for continuing to show up week after week. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you'd like to ask the speaker something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. If you go to the chat section of this presentation, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copy of Zorrie. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. And lastly, as you may know if you've participated in large virtual gatherings lately, which I'm sure you have, technical issues might come up. We do apologize in advance for that. If any technical glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Laird Hunt is an author, translator, and a professor of literary arts at Brown University. He is the author of 8 novels, including Kind One, winner of the Anisfield Wolf Book Award, the critically acclaimed Neverhome, and most recently, the amazing In the House in the Dark of the Woods, as well as a story collection and 2 book-length works translated from French. His reviews and essays have been widely published in venues including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and many others. Erica Wagner is an author, contributing literary editor at Harper's Bazaar, and lecturer in the Department of English and Creative Writing at Goldsmiths College, London. She's the author of several books, ranging from brilliant story collections to gripping biographies, including Ariel's Gift, Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath and the Story of Birthday Letters, and Chief Engineer Washington Roebling, The Man Who Built the Brooklyn Bridge. Tonight, these 2 wonderful writers join us for a discussion of Laird's latest book, Zorrie, a rare and compassionate novel that Mona Awad calls a sweeping, lyrical, and profound portrait of a remarkable woman. American fiction knows many of these remarkable women, from Willa Cather's Antonia Shimerda to Edith Wharton's May Welland to the unforgettable sisterhood of Marilyn Robbins' Housekeeping, women whose remarkability is as much a product of their profound ordinariness as it is of the swirling, historically significant plots that envelop them. In Zorrie, the eponymous Zorrie Underwood is, by some accounts, insignificant. Her life is one of loss and urgent reform, thwarted yearnings and deep, immovable roots. Yet Hunt is both willing to delve and ardently precise, crafting a story that honors the glorious brightness of the unexceptional, the light of a life spent conquering the quotidian. The slim volume is such an accomplishment, and we are so fortunate to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, I'm delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Laird and Erica.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. And I am really delighted to be here at the Harvard Bookstore. I'm joining you from London tonight, so it's a transatlantic event, and I'm really thrilled to be here with Laird Hunt, who is a writer of extraordinary range and depth. And it's a real honor to be here to celebrate the publication of his new novel, Zorrie. And I would say I think it's quite rare to become friends with a writer whose work you have admired for a very long time. So I'm really delighted to be able to say, I feel that I'm a friend of Laird's. And so that makes it an especial thrill to be here. Benjamin has said wonderful things about your work. I won't recap. I will say to all of the audience that as well as that wonderful Mona Awad quote about Zorrie, Roddy Doyle has praised it, saying it is gentle yet full of surprises, and Zorrie, the protagonist who loves her farm, and Elvis is a wonderful creation. And there's also been a magnificent review in the New York Times just today, I believe. So welcome, Laird, and thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Erica. And thanks to the Harvard Bookstore for hosting this. It's a great way to kick things off.
I would like to start really by asking this. It's such a wonderful, it's such a beautiful book, and I know because we've talked about it that it's one that has quite deep origins for you. Can you tell us a bit about where the story came from? I'm then going to ask you about Indiana, so maybe don't go into Indiana quite yet.
Okay, I'll try to hold off on the Indiana, although it's always bubbling up out of me somehow or other. Yeah, so this is, you know, I was thinking about this because I've been saying a bit lately that this is a story that I started writing in many ways 17 years ago, and sort of deliberately working on this, on what became the novel Zorrie. It lived in different shapes. It's always been a compact entity. But then I realized that in fact it has deeper roots, tangible deeper roots for me. And in fact, I guess 30 years ago, 31 years ago, I wrote a story that was called Old Woman. And I was living in Japan at the time, teaching English just out of college. And it was sort of the first story I felt excited about. And a couple of people who were in the audience were in the audience for me when I gave sort of my first public reading in my apartment in the city of Kumagaya in Japan, of this story. And I have the manuscript here of it.
Wow.
You won't be able to see it very well, but if you were able to see it better, you'd see that it says 1990, Laird Hunt. And this is what I read to my aunt and uncle, and my grandmother who was there all those years ago. And this character who is described in the first instance, peeling potatoes for dinner, and she's planning to serve them with meatloaf, creamed corn, and green beans. And it goes on from there. This is really Zorrie. This is Zorrie's first step onto the page in a way. And so for a long time, Zorrie was this character in a story. And then some 17 years ago, she came into larger, into a sort of more focus and had a larger presence for me as a writer.
I would ask, what do you think it is about a character, particularly, I'm going to use this word advisedly because she is an ordinary person. And you take your epigraph from a Flaubert story, A Simple Heart. Maybe talk a little bit about, you know, because clearly this ordinary woman has stayed with you all these years. And the novel seems to me like a celebration and an examination of quotidian life. What has kept you involved in that kind of story?
Yeah, you know, that's interesting. What just sort of came into my mind is I moved, and I'm not going to go too far into Indiana until we have the Indiana proper question, but I moved to live in Indiana when I was 13, and I came directly from London. And before London, I had lived in Singapore. I had lived in the Netherlands. I'd actually had an earlier period of time in London, and I was sort of beamed into rural Indiana. And so I had a lot of sort of the quote unquote extraordinary about the world in my mind, some traveling under my young belt. But suddenly I was in the presence of the so-called ordinary, these extraordinarily vivid people that I was surrounded by in my daily life, going to school in a high school in Clinton County, Indiana, that was surrounded by cornfields, and people living their fierce, independent thinking lives, perhaps none more so than my grandmother, who I lived with, and I suppose it was getting that dose of what seemed extraordinarily vivid to me at that crucial age, right? I'm sort of stepping into this older incarnation of myself, that has really made it glow down through the years in a way. I still am hard pressed to find people more impressive. It doesn't matter where in the world, in a sense, just in terms of inhabiting themselves and their belief in what matters, what counts, and what is substantial to them.
this book is so rich in its, well, let's come to Indiana. Let's focus on Indiana actually before I talk about the texture of the book, because aside from your particular experience, I suppose we all perhaps have been thinking about Indiana. Mike Pence was governor of Indiana. Pete Buttigieg, mayor of South Bend. So I feel that even, right in our immediate present, one of the things I've always felt in your books and in your writing about this particular state is the way it brings together an American divide, I want to say. Is that my incorrect imposition, or is that something you sense?
This grandmother that I lived with in rural Indiana, Helen Hunt, sort of in some ways embodied what you're describing. She was a fierce Democrat, and her sister down the road was not a fierce Democrat. She was down the road about, I don't know, 400 yards, and the surround was not Democrat, but they were there, even in sort of central Indiana in the 80s, and you could always talk. Everybody went to church. We all went to church. We all talked. We had disagreements, which I observed as sort of a teenager. I wasn't fully involved in all of it. But that sense of a kind of monolithic Midwest that perhaps gets projected, a sort of reductive Midwest, was not my experience of it at all. I have a cousin down in Indianapolis who's an amazing painter and artist and thinker and traveler. And I went to school in Bloomington, Indiana, and that's full of all sorts of different kinds of textures as well at Indiana University. So my experience was one, again, in this sort of formative moment. I understand the state has perhaps changed in different ways, but I still believe that there's far more to the texture of the place than people give it credit for, and it continues to compel me, maybe because of that sort of seeming contradiction, and the fact that I can go there to this day. I was there this past pandemic summer with my teenage daughter, and people are really great to talk to. I really enjoy going there.
You've written about a lot of different periods in your fiction. One of the things I so admire about your fiction is the range of time periods that it seems to me you are able to write about with unerring accuracy. It feels so alive. It feels so vivid. In the House in the Dark of the Woods was colonial era. You've written, of course, about the American Civil War in Neverhome. This is a real mid-century American novel. Zorrie is born, I think, in 1909. What made you choose for this novel that period of 20th century life?
Yeah, I suppose it goes to thinking about the youth of the people I was surrounded with as a boy and into a sort of a young man in Indiana. I was surrounded by people who were in their later years. On just the way the farms were configured around me, it was sort of populated over the years, it must be said, by older women, because the men had died in many cases. And just being fascinated by trying to think about what was it like when they were starting out in the earlier part of the century, and imagining sort of a life that stretches across it, moving into its later years in that 1980s, early 1990s period. A kind of deep fascination and understanding what was sort of standing in front of me. And again, with, I went to church every Sunday with my grandmother, and these older women largely who had clearly had fascinating lives that, it just still seems to me really worth exploring and taking seriously and thinking about and allowing to have, that thought to have a granular texture that isn't just sort of broad strokes in a way. And that's always been really important to me, to look closely when it's possible, where it's possible.
Maybe at the mention of looking closely, maybe now is a time to hear a little bit of Zorrie. Will you read a little bit for us?
Sure, I'd love to. And I wanted to say, just give a shout. This book is dedicated to Carolyn Anderson, Stephen Hunt, and my late grandfather, Morris Hunt. And I wanted to give a shout to my aunt and my father, who are in the audience tonight, and have been very inspiring and supportive throughout all of this. Hoosiers, people who know this landscape better than I do, it must be said. So I want to read. I'm going to jump in a little bit. It won't need a lot of introduction, but there's a moment fairly early in Zorrie's life where, not sure what to do with herself, she makes her way one state over to the west, to Illinois, and finds herself a job in a radium dial processing plant, and becomes, for a short period of time, a Radium Girl, as they were called. There were other names as well. Which, there's a whole tragic history that's explored beautifully in books like Kate Moore's The Radium Girls, and Carol Langer has an amazing documentary. A lot of people have been exploring this history, but I thought I would just give a little bit of a taste of Zorrie, who's actually in Illinois, but she's always thinking about Indiana. Maybe that'll come up in what I'm going to read, and I won't read for terribly long, maybe about 5 minutes. So she's just gotten her job. She was to sit in a large, airy room in the converted high school and paint the numbers on clock faces with luminous paint. This was, she was told, important work. Not just households across the region, but the mighty armed forces of the nation were depending on it being done well. She received 20 minutes of instruction, which included several comments about the safety of the dull yellow powder she was supposed to dip her wet brush into before placing it between her lips to point the tip. The powder tasted like metal mixed with the late roots her aunt had always insisted they boil and eat, even when there were other options in the pantry cupboard. And her first few attempts at making lines and numbers on the practice faces were a mess. She soon saw how it could be done, though, and her instructor nodded, patted her once on the shoulder, and told her she could now work on the real thing. When the instructor was gone, the girls on either side of Zorrie rose as one from their places, took her by the elbows, and led her into the adjoining windowless lavatory, where with some ceremony they had her stand in front of the mirror over the sink before flipping the lights off. First, Zorrie saw that her lips were alive with yellow, and then that her fingertips were covered in glowing splotches. The girls behind her were glowing too. One of them had painted a heart on her cheek, the other had painted an eye on her forehead. Their hair and dresses shimmered. Their lips and teeth, too, were golden. They waved their arms and shook their shoulders, and as they giggled, sent off little clouds of glowing powder to drift through the dark. "I'm Marie Martins," said the one with the heart. "And I'm Janie Clemens," said the one with the eye. Zorrie's head felt like it might float off her shoulders when she came out of the bathroom behind them, and her feet felt just as light. She thought she might rise entire from the floor to twist and float against the ceiling beams. Mary and Janie shared their lunches with her. They ate at their places and had a bowl of peppermints they encouraged Zorrie to help herself to. Many of the girls kept candy near them to counter the taste of the paint. They laughed a great deal and made their brushes fly over the clock faces and never stopped talking as they worked. Zorrie had slept the night before in the hayloft of an abandoned barn behind a wheat field that ran green and sloping down to the banks of the Illinois. And when the day had gone to its grave, she started off for it. Janie called her back, though. She said Zorrie wasn't going to sleep in any barn. Zorrie asked how Janie knew where she was heading, and Janie laughed and said Ottawa was just a little bitty town. For her part, she planned to move to Chicago as soon as she had tucked enough away. She told Zorrie as they went back to her house. She would live in her own apartment and take the L each day and never come back home to Ottawa. Well, maybe sometimes on holidays. She didn't like Christmas much, but Easter and the 4th of July were fun. Zorrie asked her what the L was. Janie laughed again and hooked her arm through Zorrie's. When they got to her house, Janie hugged and kissed and shoved her way through a horde of younger brothers and sisters. And once they were in the small room, she got to herself because she had started bringing in money, showed Zorrie a picture postcard of an elevated rail line that ran 25 feet off the ground. You'll think about clock faces tonight, but stay here a while and you'll be thinking about trains that can drop you off in the stars. Zorrie was too tired to think about clocks or anything else that first night and the ones that followed, and was happy for it, but she never grew tired of listening to Janie talk about Chicago. Sometimes Marie came over and took a seat at the huge table Janie's mother set, and when they had finished helping clean up afterward, the three of them would step out into the quiet streets. Once or twice they met up with other girls from the plant and would walk in a large, glowing group through the town. Zorrie saw her first movie in their company. She ate her first ice cream sundae with them. She collected her first paycheck with Marie on one side of her and Janie on the other, and that was the way they sat together during Sunday services. They swam in both the Fox and the Illinois. They lifted their hands above their heads and kicked their heels and shook the fringes of their dresses at the boys who were always just a soft holler away, always ready to joke and dance. Zorrie talked about home in Indiana so often, she didn't even know she was doing it. One of the other girls at work started referring to her as Indiana, but the nickname didn't stick. People in town called everyone who worked with a brush at the radium plant Ghost Girls. One night, Zorrie and Janie painted the bed frame of her littlest sisters with circles and squares so that it would glow while they slept. They told them a story to go with the design about a magical country filled with fairies. Zorrie thought of the landscape around her aunt's house when she told her part of the story, though she didn't say this. Marie almost always kept a tin of the company's Luna powder on her, and whenever an evening out on Janie's porch grew too dull or just quiet, she would toss a glittering pinch of it up into the air and break into song. Ghost girl, why'd you grow your hair so long?
Thank you. That's just wonderful. And I was going to ask you about this section of the novel, and I suppose it's also a larger question about research for novels. Is this a story, the story of these Radium Girls? Did you know it already? Did you find it in looking for ways to approach Zorrie's story? How did that come about?
So I've been fascinated with the Radium Girls for quite a while. I saw an article in the 90s in the New York Times about Radium Girls and about they would dip their brushes in this toxic paint and point the brush with their lips, and the history is starting to be better known. But it really struck me. As a matter of fact, it struck me so much that I made a copy of the article. I clipped the article and wrote a letter and sent it to the writer W.G. Sebald, who I had a very sort of one-sided correspondence with, although he always sent me back lovely short notes. But anyway, so it was something on my mind, for quite a while, and I was doing research on it again for a novel that didn't gain traction, and I had been thinking about Zorrie, which had another title then, and was sort of conceived a little bit differently. And I've wondered about this, and I wondered about what would happen to this fairly early in her life, this character who was so identified with Indiana, if she went one state over to the town of Ottawa, Illinois, where there had been one of these radium processing dial painting companies, and she got a job there. And so I was able to use the research I'd done, including a visit to Ottawa, Illinois, and a lot of reading about it and about earlier incarnations of corporate malfeasance around phosphorus, on matchsticks and that sort of thing. I was able to sort of build that into the story to, in a way, it on the one hand, radium, there's sort of a beauty to it. But as we know now, it's terribly, terribly dangerous. And both of those threads move through the book was my hope. And so it was one of those things that I wasn't sure if it would work, but I was able to, felt like, build it out enough that the strand could reach all the way almost to the end of the book. And so I felt kind of glad about it. I tried a couple of other things that didn't work quite as well.
Yes, and I think it works. I think it works beautifully. One of the ways in which it does, though, it seems to me, is it's fascinating when you talk about researching, of course, these cases of corporate malfeasance. And when you read that passage and you hear about the girls interacting so casually and happily with what we now know is this deadly substance. I wonder how much, when you're writing, this is kind of a process question, to work to kind of keep yourself in the present moment of those, at the time, young women's stories. You never feel, although we know as readers what this means. The wonder of the writing is how deeply in the present it is to me.
That I think that's essential. It would be a tremendous disservice to project my, sort of 21st century positionality onto these young people who, in their case, often they became the biggest money makers in the household. These teenage girls, in some cases, and very, very young women in their 20s. Who their lives were transformed by this. And this was not just a sort of localized Illinois phenomenon. There was another factory in Orange, New Jersey, and other places that, people drank radium at the time, and radium tonics. There was a special wool that was advertised in France. I don't know how far it spread, but a wool that was woven with radium fiber. The idea was to keep your small children warm in the wintertime. It's horrifying in a way, but it was part of this wondrous substance. And there, the people doing demonstrations would take a big spoonful of it and eat it to show how safe it was, especially when the reports started coming in later. And so, yeah, it seemed really important to be in that sort of vivid present, and then to allow within, again, the clock of the novel, lives were wrecked by this. By the time we're into the 30s and 40s, lives have just been really wrecked. I paid a visit when I went to Ottawa to the cemetery where a number of the Radium Girls, as they were called again, are buried. And I brought a Geiger counter because I had read, I think, in Kate Moore's book, maybe Claudia Clark's book as well, about that they were still hot, so to speak, right? And indeed, my Geiger counter crackled when I went to these particular graves and the area around them. So even though it stopped glowing, the substance stops glowing after 20 or 30 years, they're going to be hot for about 1,600 years, their remains.
Gosh, that's really striking. Another question about putting together a novel like this, and I'm cautious of giving too much away, of course, for people who haven't read the book. But I'm gonna go for a tiny spoiler because it does happen quite early, which is Zorrie marries and her husband dies in the war. And as I say, that happens quite early on in the book. And it's done in this, again, I want to say, undramatic in the best sense. It feels absolutely real. This is not how events are dramatized in books. This is how they happen in real life. That's what makes it so shocking. And that's true to me of all the events in her life. And I wonder how you think, because you've written about more dramatic events, say the American Civil War, and how do you kind of apply different techniques of construction to maintain such narrative tension when the events are on a small scale and often have the abruptness of real life?
I maybe just thinking about, sort of returning to that epigraph, which comes from Gustave Flaubert's A Simple Heart, and thinking about that story, and without going into great detail, one of the things that it does is it takes these relatively insignificant moments in this person's life, and puts a the spotlight of attention onto them. And then, but it never dwells on these things, right? So that there's death in that story. There's great rearrangement of this character's life, circumstances of her life in A Simple Heart. But then we're on to something else. And that seemed to me a useful way to approach this. The drama of Zorrie's life it's very real, right? I mean, it's just as it is for all of us. The dramas in our lives aren't necessarily going to make the news, but they're very real to us. And so there's thinking of that, also thinking about the way, again, that observation, having spent so much time there. And as I, sort of, as I said, it was a population at a certain juncture at church on Sunday where there were far more older women than there were older men in the room. So clearly, the men had died. And people were, of course, they were terribly sad, but the way that manifested was in cases I remember at any rate, quite understated. Right, people weren't staggering around and proclaiming their sadness. There was a sort of a kind of stoicism, I suppose. And the ceremonies that attended them, the church services, the viewings, all of that sort of mechanism seemed to contain or be a container in most cases for grief. Of course, what happened, in private, behind closed doors is something else, but the public demonstrations of it, and also, so thinking of this particular character, it made a lot of sense for things to happen, and then for her to allow it to enter, but then to continue, right? There's this sort of, she is someone who continues. She continues to move forward. And I found it tremendously satisfying to be writing this character who seems have so much integrity, who was so felt so solid to me, but wasn't doing anything grandiose. There were, a gun was never drawn in the course of, maybe at some point Zorrie, picked up a rifle, with someone, a rabbit or a groundhog, in her views, because it was going after her garden. But that would be about the extent of the drama, right? And yet it feels, I think, quite real, and she is able to. She's a sort of character who can see not only her own circumstances, but those of those she is close to, her who surround her, and she absorbs it and is able to hold it.
And that's another thing you get very much in this novel, is a sense of community, which I think we probably would all agree is a kind of rarer and rarer thing, that we are living, pandemic aside, in an increasingly atomized society. Is that something you were aware of? And also because I know that there are characters in this book that appear in another of your books. So there's a kind of community that goes even beyond this particular novel. Is that sense of community also something you wanted to remind us of, I almost want to say?
Yeah. It was really important to me. Again, coming in, sort of beaming in a way to rural Indiana, to discover just how strong that sense of community was. I've evoked the context of the church, and the churches that dotted the countryside. And sometimes one went to it, found oneself in another church for whatever reason. But there were also the schools, and the school community was really pretty exhilarating. I mean, I had been at the American School of London the year before with kids who were like me, there for a year or two and then off to the next thing with their family, and that had its own excitements. But there was really something about these kids. They all had known each other forever. Their parents knew each other. A lot of them had roots that went pretty far back in that Clinton County context. And it was for me, a kind of space of discovery in a way, to find how could I become a part of it, and even, sort of maintain it, because I was there for the school years and chunks of the summer, but then I would also go and visit my father, who was in, for a long time in Hong Kong. There was a summer in Taipei. And yet when I would return to Indiana, I was never asked about what I'd done over the summer. And when I went to Hong Kong, I was never asked about what was going on back in Indiana. So there was this split existence that I had. And I suppose it took me a while to fully develop the taste for being part of that Indiana community. But I found it, or I find it memorable in ways that are significant, and in ways that perhaps I've tried to duplicate in my relationships, my friendships, my life as a writer. That sense of community becomes ever more important to the endeavor, a kind of sense of shared endeavor, perhaps, in writing, in the arts, in thinking. And now, of course, we're in this period of the pandemic where the notion of being in this thing together, even if there are, all sorts of imbalances within that, it's tremendously important to me. And yeah, and maybe Zorrie is a kind of flare shot up as a reminder that it's real and it's meaningful to be in community in the way that Zorrie is.
I think it does have an extraordinary resonance. I think it would, of course, at any time, but right now, to be dropped into this group of people who are struggling together and working to help each other when people die, when there are fires, when there are the kinds of disasters that, as you say, look small from the outside, but are seismic in these communities. I do think it's a particularly powerful experience to have now. Before we carry on, I just want to urge our audience, if you do have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. I'll start to have a look, and then we will have some time for questions at the end. But because one of the advantages of this of the virtual event is, as questions occur to you, you can just drop them into the Q&A. So please don't hesitate. Laird, I've said to you often that one of the things I so admire about your work is the way that you write women. I think there are so many wonderful women in your books. And so this question isn't really, how do you do that? Because that's the job of the writer, is to imagine themselves into other lives. But it is fascinating to me that you are drawn to doing this again and again. And I wonder if you'd say something about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sort of thought after In the House in the Dark of the Woods, the last book, that maybe I inhabited that sort of positionality adequately, and that I was going to be thinking about other things, other types of characters. I'm writing right now a novel from the perspective of an elephant who's swimming the length of the Mississippi River, for example. But somehow the manuscript of Zorrie, that character, just over the years, those 17 years of actively being engaged with it, would just sort of gnaw on me. I'd go back in and I'd work on it some more, and it seemed to be at a certain, I forget what the circumstances were, but I was taking another look at it and thought, maybe there's something here, and I passed it on to my agent, who's wonderful in her the clarity she offers when she thinks something is working. That's emphatic, and when it's not, that's emphatic too, and I really value that. And so with some trepidation, I gave it to her, and it came out in the oh, this is interesting. And so that's sort of curving around to what your original question was about writing women. So then there was this new book that in a way was my first book. The manuscript existed before all these others, Kind One and Neverhome and The Evening Road and In the House in the Dark of the Woods. Zorrie was there first, and in a way she was my first sort of as I waved at the start, the story, Old Woman, she was kind of my first character. So I've been thinking about writing in this space for a long time, and it's kind of been a co-traveler with me. I heard lots, I got very stern messages, as for very good reason, I think, in the 90s when I was coming up about, don't do that. Don't write from the perspective of a woman. Don't write, and I listened, right, and I absorbed it. But this character who had already written before I started really hearing that loudly was in the back of my mind, and these other ideas. I spent 5 years in a farmhouse with my grandmother, and thinking about, and it was just the two of us for much, most of the time, and just thinking, but I can't write about her. Even if I try hard, etc., or people like her, right? Because I've never written about my grandmother in a direct way. But it started to be something that I thought about somewhat actively. But it was really when this novel, Kind One, this voice came out, sort of came up and out fiercely, and I just had to write this story. And then I asked the questions later. Well, gosh, should I have done it? And that didn't seem very interesting to me, frankly. Should I have done it? But is this decent? Is it okay? And I gave it to some readers, certainly women. And I got back, okay, this isn't working. You need to work on this part. But okay, the core of this is all right. And then this series of stories started to come, and there was that return to this manuscript. And what moves us to write? You chose to write about the person who built the Brooklyn Bridge in chief engineer. What is it for you? What was it about inhabiting that space, if I can just turn it around for a second, to write about Roebling and to spend presumably years thinking about it?
Well, yes, exactly as you said. You can't ever quite put your finger on why someone speaks to you. And I think, although Washington Roebling was a real historical character, in a sense, when we start to think about real characters from the past, we are creating them as fictions because we cannot ever know. So that what you described, particularly with Kind One, of hearing a voice that you just have to set down. I always say to my students, and both of us teach, if you feel you have no choice, that's when you can really go forward. And I would say too, before I turn to some questions we have from the audience, and since you mentioned Kind One, and because I have written about the 19th century and I'm now writing fiction set in the 19th century, as have you, what do you feel when you write in a historical period that's beyond living memory? What obligations do you feel you have to the accuracy, of the past? How do you go about creating what is certainly, I think, to your readers, an incredibly vivid and true portrait of a time?
It was, I think I had done some of this work thinking about the past and writing in the past when I started reading Hilary Mantel pretty seriously, when the Cromwell books started coming out, and she was being more her interviews and so forth, and her expressions of her, the sense of the way she did things were more available. But it really resonated with me to hear her talking about the importance of nailing down through research all that you could nail down, right? Sort of putting the pillars of the hall in place. And then what happened, what sort of dances occurred in the space where we didn't have the information, but that was, obviously affected by the context that the information had given you. Well, that was fair game for the imagination, but you always had to be aware of that sort of structure. And obviously I've been writing very different books from Mantell, and but something about doing the research that was possible, doing as much of it as I could, even for me though, which is different from Mantell, I think, even as I was writing. So I write and research simultaneously with these works set in the past. And that's been very important for me to keep my imagination alive around it. And I don't know if that, if that was your experience writing about Roebling, but when I would discover some new things, say about, what those women soldiers during the Civil War had done to disguise themselves, some method that I hadn't heard about, a kind of, the way of attaching a mustache that a particular kind of wax, that could give me 15 pages. My imagination would just go wild. I mean, did you have moments like that when you were writing?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Because I'm always looking for the thing I don't know I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And I think you can get bogged down and kind of distracted by research. But it's a careful balance, because you also, to me, need to be inspired. I would say, I will think to add in, because I was speaking to Hilary Mantel about the latest, the final book, The Wonderful, The Mirror and the Light. And we met to talk about it actually in Hampton Court Palace. Which of course was Cardinal Wolsey's palace. And what is interesting, and again comes back to what you and I were saying, for all of her deep research, she too, I think, is informed by this sense of magic, the speaking voice, because she told me that she was taken on a trip to Hampton Court Palace when she was 12. And she was a working class girl from Derbyshire, never been to a place like this. She came into this palace and she said she remembers thinking, this is my place. This is my place. And then all those decades later, wrote the Cromwell novels.
No, I love knowing that.
So it's kind of balance, I always think, between that research and that magical thing that you can't put your finger on.
And I should say, before we see if there are any questions, for, that sort of, this is my place, I have a little bit of a sense of that with that rural Indiana landscape. And then I should say that often my research, even for something like Neverhome, which was fairly research intensive, some of the research was just going out and walking the fields, and picking up handfuls of dirt and smelling them, that kind of thing. So that, you mentioned magic. I think that's what, why I think of that. But those sort of, those things you don't know, as you say, you're looking for, often I found them by just taking a walk through a space, whether it's a battlefield in Maryland or Virginia or a farm in rural Indiana.
I will now turn to to some audience questions. So we have an anonymous question. This book has been described as slim or brief. While drafting it and its iterations, was there ever a longer story that you edited down? It's because it's very spare. Did you strip things out of it?
Yeah. So I did strip things out of it, but it was a case of swapping out, actually. That there was this earlier incarnation of the book that lived in the drawer, as it were, the drawer of the computer, for quite a while, and it had different sections. The trip that Zorrie takes later in the book, she takes one trip after the journey to Illinois, but she takes one trip out of the United States. It was to a completely different country. But so in other words, when something was taken out, I put something back in. So it was never a longer book that I sort of cut down, right? There wasn't a 250-page Zorrie. There are some sections that got, thankfully, thank goodness, left after, tossed aside because they just didn't work and they didn't serve the book.
A question from my friend, Grace McNamee. Hi, Laird. I know that Noah in particular appears in another of your novels. how do you take a smaller character from a previous book and weave them into the narrative of another character's story?
Yeah, so glad to have that question, because it hasn't really been described. The fact that Zorrie came out of a kind of very small, Zorrie has a role in this earlier novel, Indiana, Indiana. She's sort of known as the woman next door. The center of that novel is Noah, Noah Summers, and his family. Ruby and Virgil are his parents. They figure in Zorrie, as does Noah. But the old woman next door, something about her really struck me, and I think probably the unsaying part of my mind already knew that this was the old woman from my very early story. I hadn't made those connections yet, but I really felt when I was done writing Indiana, Indiana, which is a very different sort of novel, structurally, etc. That I wasn't done with the landscape, and I really was intrigued by this character who comes and stands and sort of says her piece to Noah Summers in Indiana, Indiana, and I wanted to know what her life was like. I wanted to know why he was so interested in her, this woman living alone on the farm, one farm over. Why was she living alone? All of these questions. And so I think I wrote the initial draft with all of those flaws that I was talking about pretty quickly those 17 years ago. And then I felt like maybe I had done enough with that landscape, and I went back into some other things.
A question from Anderson, who wants to know, what is the flow or structure for your writing schedule, and has it changed in the pandemic?
Yeah, great question. So I had a couple of shifts. I used to be a late night writer. I wrote my first few books late into the night. My wife, Eleni, is also, she inclines towards the deep hours. And at a certain juncture, maybe around the time that our daughter was born, I started getting more interested in mornings, partly because I was able to be, up and, being with our daughter, those early morning hours. And I started getting up earlier and earlier before that to get a bit of work done before the day of work, and also being with our daughter. And that sort of stuck. And I became more interested in working in the morning. And so these years later, I'm much more inclined to do creative work in the morning. I'll do schoolwork or that kind of thing at night. During the pandemic, there have been all of the time, we've sort of left Chronos and gotten really involved in Kairos in this way that's intriguing to me. And I've been sort of filling these moments with investigations of earlier manuscripts. I took a story that I left by the wayside in the period of writing Neverhome and The Evening Road. It's set in the sort of 1870s or something. And it was about 17 pages of an idea that I just hadn't gotten anywhere with. And the pandemic somehow, I don't even know where the time came from or where it's gone, I guess, allowed me to draft a Zorrie-sized novel out of that with, it needs a lot of work, as they say. But just to say that I found myself able to work sometimes in the afternoon, mornings still are there, available. I'm very careful to, when I'm doing sort of Zoom school stuff, to have the computer in one place. Like I have an office at school, and so that's where I am now. And then when I'm writing, I create a different kind of context for that. That's been important, because otherwise my mind gets just hijacked by the circumstance of our new lives.
Someone asks both of us, saying that they have enjoyed the conversation, and which is very nice, and I'm certainly enjoying it. I'd love to hear from both of you. Maybe you'd start, Laird, if you've read anything lately that you've loved.
Yes, I just read, and I'd never finished it, even though actually I've used a little bit of it as an epigraph. William Maxwell's "So Long, See You Tomorrow," which is just a stunner of a book, just so marvelous. And that's an Illinois-centered novel. but just fantastic. And I reread Train Dreams by Dennis Johnson fairly recently, and that was amazing. And then in terms of not rereading, the last thing I read that I've really enjoyed was Hiroko Oyamada's The Hole that New Directions put out. And so, yeah, I've been having good luck with reading lately. How about you, Erica?
Have you read They Came Like Swallows? Which
No.
is because then that's about the influenza pandemic. That's William Maxwell, and it's about 1918. And
that's amazing. I haven't read that one. He wrote so many books. I've read about 2 or 3, but not that one.
I read, let's see. Well, I just read Ethan Hawke's new novel, which has just come out. I was doing an event with him at the South Bank over here in London, which is called A Bright Ray of Darkness, which is about an actor in a production of Henry IV. And I really enjoyed that. I thought it was great.
Oh, wow.
And then I also just read Ya Gyasi's new novel, Transcendent Kingdom, which I enjoyed. But going back to classics, and indeed talking about a simple heart, because I suppose it was about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I will confess that for the first time, I had never read Madame Bovary.
Oh.
I finally did. And now, essentially, I reread it constantly. I just keep it on my desk, like a kind of writing manual. You know, if you're in danger of feeling that you can't get involved in the world, Madame Bovary will take you there. And that's one of the things that I felt, and I think we'll have our final question. The detail of Flaubert, the detail of daily life is so powerful. And so our last question is, this book loves small, intimate details. Was it a delight to write about a character and her daily sustaining pleasures?
I think, yeah, this book was one of the most pleasurable for me to spend time with the books that I've written. In the revision process, sort of that fine tuning, getting those details right. When I was my wife Eleni gave the book a read, and she had been reading Toni Morrison's Sula, and was talking about Morrison's wonderful close work. We don't always talk about that. She's really good at the close work. So many things to talk about with Morrison. But thinking about just going in and finding even more small details, and part of my the revision process with my editor, Lisa Mayer at Bloomsbury, was, had me thinking about that. Like, just this, I want to find a few more things that Zorrie is looking closely at. There's a scene that came in very late about her sharpening tools. She's upset with her husband, and she's sharpening things out on the back steps. And that was a pleasure. She's angry, but she's also carefully doing her work. And that, was just a joy to be in that space of someone who cares deeply about all of those so-called small things, because they are the big things. They are her life.
They are life, I would say, altogether. I'm going to turn over back now to Benjamin and the Harvard Bookstore. But thank you so much, Laird. That's really wonderful speaking to you.
Thank you, Erica. It was a joy.
Yes, thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation. I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I know everyone in the audience has as well. Thank you to everyone in the audience for spending your evening with us and for showing up for Harvard Bookstore and our community of amazing authors. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Zorrie at harvard.com. I've put the link in the chat a couple times. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your week, everyone. Keep reading and stay safe. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.